Alright, so you missed out on the PulseChain sacrifice phase, but you got involved in the PulseX sacrifice phase. Well, good for you. You're already involved in 1 out of 3 of my favorite assets, so you're already a third of the way there at least when it comes to HEX, PulseChain, and PulseX and being part of the financial revolution. And I believe a lot of these assets are going to do extremely well over the next couple of years. Obviously, that's not a guarantee, but there's a lot of people out there that clearly found out about PulseX after the PulseChain sacrifice phase was over. Now, the PulseChain sac phase was obviously a lot shorter, only 19 days as opposed to over 40 for PulseX. And obviously, we can just tell this because the amount of money put into PulseX is at, about $1 billion, whereas the amount of money put into PulseChain during the sacrifice phase was only about 670 million. So still really high numbers, but something tells me there's a lot of you out there that have a bunch of PulseX but don't have any Pulse, and I've been hearing it a lot. So we're going to go over a couple of really dangerous pre-bridge strategies, and I'm going to talk about some predictions that I might make that can of course be totally wrong because these are predictions and I'm just a guy on YouTube trying to do my best to do some simple math, okay? Now, let's make some assumptions, and this is of course really dangerous, guys. You know what happens when we make assumptions. It's probably going to end up being wrong, and some crazy stuff is probably going to end up happening that we all cannot predict. But let's do our best for the time being because it makes for an interesting topic, right? So let's assume that, the best PLSX price, okay, it's not an official price, right? Because you're buying essentially sacrifice points. But let's assume that the price is around $0.0001 without any volume multiplier. Now, if you're a bigger whale or if you got in bigger, you obviously get some kind of volume multiplier. But to make it simple, let's assume you're the smallest of the small fish and you only donated like $10 to freedom of speech and freedom of movement. So let's assume you don't get any volume multiplier, okay? This is just for a uniform price that might apply to even the smallest of the plankton out there. Now, how do I get that number? Well, if you got in early on either sacrifice phase, we know there was a time where $1 equated to 10,000 sacrifice points. If 1 sacrifice point is equivalent to 1 coin or token, well, $1 divided by 10,000 equals 0.0001. That's a decimal point with 3 zeros and a 1. Okay, so let's assume the best PLSX price was a uniform 0.0001, and let's assume this was also true for PLS, okay, because again, same concept. There was a time where $1 got you 10,000 SAC points, and again, let's just assume for ease of use that there's no volume multipliers involved. Okay, let's also assume that USDC pairs are too risky. I talked about this on my last video about the pre-bridge sacrifice strategy, where I basically said, if you don't know what you're doing, stay out of it. It's too risky. You're probably going to lose all your money. Okay? So let's just assume very reasonably that USDC does not hold its peg because there's no reason for these centralized companies to honor USDC being $1. Now, if the people out there want to pay $1 for a literal clone of USDC on PulseChain, I can't help them. I might even be selling into that buy pressure, but I don't think there's any reason for it to hold its peg, and as a reasonable person, I can't assume that because it's just too dangerous. Now let's also assume that the PLS supply is approximately 1 million X of the supply of Ethereum. Now in my next video, I'll make a quick video about calculating the rough total supply of PulseChain because that's a question that I hear come up a lot too. And it's probably in all likelihood going to be a little bit more than 1 million X, the supply of Ethereum, right? This is really good for unit bias because when things start off at a really small decimal point number of US dollars, it makes it a lot easier for us to conceptualize the price going up to a penny, right? And if something starts off at 100th or 1,000th of a penny, then by the time it's at a penny, it's already done 1,000x, right? And then it's much more easier for us to comprehend going from a penny to $1. That's basically the unit bias problem in a nutshell. But I'm getting off topic, okay? Let's assume there's about 1 million times the supply of ETH total for PulseChain tokens. And one thing I got to be clear about is that only the HEX PLS pair is really guaranteed to exist here, okay? All the PLSX pairs, they're not going to exist, immediately from day one because PLSX doesn't exist yet. So it's up to the actual people to put up liquidity on pairs like PLSX PLS or PLSX HEX, right? Because these coins, the coin PLSX does not exist yet, right? And even though PLS doesn't exist yet, the conversion mechanism is going to be basically that every Ethereum transforms into a PLS token, okay? That's kind of how it's going to work. But PLSX, there's no equivalent coin transforming into PLSX. It's going to be up to the people to provide liquidity. So we also can't guarantee that there's going to be liquid pairs, even though I think it's likely that people will be putting up liquidity on, for example, PLSX, PLS. There's not a guarantee, right? But for now, what we do have, what we know we have, is on Uniswap V2, we have a HEX Ethereum pair. And so we know that's going to get copied over, and that's going to automatically become a HEX PLS pair. So again, only the HEX PLS pair is really guaranteed to exist due to the forking of Uniswap V2. And again, guys, pre-bridge strategies are totally risky. So don't make any life-changing decisions based on this. Just try to understand what I'm talking about, and if you think I'm missing something or you want to add on top of this thought process, you're obviously free to do that. I always encourage thinking for yourself, obviously, and taking responsibility for your own actions. Now, if we go to uniswap.info, this is where we can actually go to uniswap.info and click on the V2, the legacy version, and this is the data for the HEX Ethereum pair on Uniswap V2. So you got to go to uniswap.info to see this, and you also have to click V2 up in the top right corner to go to the legacy information bar. But as of today, earlier today, this value is always changing, right? But there were 13 million HEX on the HEX side of the pool and 864 ETH on the Ethereum side of the pool. So let's use these numbers as a potentially realistic example of what might actually happen when PulseChain launches and when the liquidity ratio fixer bot actually goes in and does a buy on a lot of these PRC20s, right? We're going to use HEX ETH as an example because it's going to turn into HEX PLS, right? So when ETH becomes Pulse and Uniswap V2 becomes PulseX, right, and we're all trading on there, let's just say that the numbers don't even change from today. Obviously, they're going to change. It's always fluctuating and it's very complex, but 864 ETH becomes 864 PLS, and then we've still got 13,190,746 HEX on the HEX side, okay? Now look at these numbers, guys. Doesn't that look a little off to you? I mean, because of the units of PLS are going to be so high, and a lot of you guys out there that sacrificed even $100 or $1,000, you're probably going to have millions of PLS because of the whole units thing. Remember, there's a lot of units of PLS because it gives it a lot more room to grow. So if there's only 864 PLS sitting over here, any one person could just come in with their millions of PLS that they just got for a really relatively cheap sacrifice, you don't even have to be that rich to be a holder of a million PLS. And the reason that this bot exists is because if it didn't, any user, basically it'd be a race to see who could buy up all this HEX first, because the ratio is way off on here. And a lot of people are going to be sitting around with millions and millions of Pulse in their wallets, and with a ratio like this, only 864 Pulse, that's almost nothing, right? So the first transaction theoretically could unfairly be able to buy an inordinate amount of HEX, right? An extremely high amount of HEX, and then that guy would just be rich, and then he could also risk dumping on the market, right? So because again, there's approximately a million X times the supply of Pulse and ETH, and we know that these ratios are proportionally related to each other by a square. Well, what the fixer bot is going to do to fix these ratios is it's going to add 1,000x to the PLS side, and it's going to subtract 1,000x from the HEX side. And 1,000 times 1,000 is a million X, right? So basically the transaction, what it's going to do is it's going to make one big purchase by inputting a bunch of PLS tokens that are newly minted. About 2.5% of the supply is minted for this bot. And in return, it's going to extract and take out 1,000x of the HEX. So it's basically just making one big buy on all these liquid pairs. It's using a bunch of newly, freshly minted PLS to buy up all the PRC20 sides, and it's basically going to add 1,000x to the PLS side and subtract 1,000x from the HEX side to fix the ratios, because the prices of coins in an automated market maker is literally just based on the ratio. The ratio is the price, okay? I have previous videos about that. I recommend you go check them out. So what's this new ratio? We can do some quick math. 864 times 1,000 leaves us with 864,000 PLS, and dividing the HEX side by 1,000, we get 13,191 HEX. So this would theoretically be the initial liquidity locked on the PulseX platform on the PLS HEX pair. Now again, I could be missing something here. Maybe I'm wrong, okay? I'm not an expert. I don't quite know for sure how this is going to go down. It's a very risky, novel thing that we've never seen before, guys. It's very paradigm-shifting stuff. But if this is the case, then we can roughly calculate the new price in terms of ratios to be 65.5 PLS per HEX, otherwise known as the inverse of that, which is 0.015 HEX per PLS, which means PLS is roughly, 1.5% of the price of HEX, whatever that is in US dollars. And of course, it's hard to tell in US dollars because there won't be a US dollar pairing for those first 2 days, okay? And we're talking about the first 2 days, the pre-bridge environment here. That's specifically what I'm talking about. Now, if we continue to estimate that PLS has a price of $0.0001, then that would put HEX at a price of $0.00655. Now, we compare that to the price today of 20 cents, and that seems pretty low, right? So if I'm a guy that bought a bunch of PLS in a sacrifice, and I choose to value my PLS token at $0.0001, and that's how I want to do it in my mind, then that would put HEX at theoretically $0.0065, which, as we know, is a lot lower than it is today. I mean, HEX went as high as 50 cents, so that's, just under 100x off of a discount. So that would look very attractive for me to buy if I was choosing to value PLS this way. Now, if I was choosing instead to value HEX at the, let's say, the pre-fork prices let's say 20 cents, let's just assume HEX doesn't move at all, which is also unlikely, but for the sake of the example, let's say it's at the prices it's at today of 20 cents. Well, if I'm using 20 cent HEX as a reference point, then doing the math here from this ratio would put PLS at a price of 0.003, which again, assuming I got in at 0.0001, that's already a 30x. So I'd be happy if HEX continued to be valued at 20 cents because that means I already made, theoretically, a 30x on my money from day one off the bat on PulseChain. So either way you cut it, guys, either if you want to value Pulse this way, then HEX looks really cheap. If you want to value HEX this way, then Pulse looks really expensive. So it looks like I gained a lot already right off the bat. Now this leads me to a kind of conclusion where swapping HEX for PLS might be the best way to secure your PLS bag. Okay, I'm saying might. None of this is a guarantee. But if you buy liquid HEX now and you get it copied over to PulseChain, that might give you the best opportunity to lock in your PLS position and your bag early on, if you want to be crazy and do some crazy stuff in the first day or two. Okay, so if you're feeling wild and you're feeling risky, which you might be because you're in crypto, people may be swapping PLS for what they perceive to be cheap HEX at first, right? Remember, if HEX is perceived to be 0.006, I'd call that cheap. You know, as a trader, which I'm not, I might want to trade some PLS for HEX. I mean, I'm happy with all my bags, guys. I don't plan to be making any moves personally, guys. This is just what other people might do. So again, if early guys value PLS at 0.0001 USD, then HEX is looked at as much lower than the pre-fork price, and they may be inclined to buy up the price of HEX with their PLS bags. Now, if people value HEX at around the pre-fork price, you know, no matter which way you cut it, then they perceive PLS to have already done a 30x, so the holders might choose to buy the price of HEX up via that method too. So you, as a person that missed out on the PulseChain sacrifice phase, might be able to take advantage of all this and basically take advantage of the other side of the trade, where you're instead swapping HEX for PLS, rather than the whales that got in early on PLS, which are maybe inclined to swap their PLS for HEX. You know what I mean? So you could just do the opposite of what some whales might do, and that's if they do this. Again, it's not a guarantee. They might not do this at all. So securing your PLS bag, what I'm saying is it might be easier by just swapping HEX for PLS, especially because you can always buy HEX today, right now, to prepare yourself for that situation. Now the other option could be swapping PLSX for PLS, and this might not be, you know, the best option, okay? A lot of people are probably going to try to do this. But again, it's impossible to know the ratio here because the liquidity pair doesn't currently exist. Also, this pair isn't guaranteed to be liquid. Again, the users have to put up the liquidity. So you're basically relying on a bunch of people to put up liquidity, and there's no telling how much or how little liquidity they'll put up. Now, I think out of all the coins, it's probably most likely that there is going to be liquidity on this pair because all the attention is going to be focused around these three coins, right? Especially PLSX and PLS2. So although it's not guaranteed to be liquid, I think it is likely to be liquid or semi-liquid personally, you know, liquid enough for an average sized person to be able to trade. But we don't know the ratio. But one really simple thing you could do, you know, again, assuming that the best price you could have gotten minus the volume multiplier was 0.0001 for both PLSX and PLS, right? If you see the PLSX-PLS ratio going above 1, that means that compared to PLS, PLSX is worth more, right? So then you might consider swapping some PLSX for PLS, if that happens to be the case. Now, we might never see a ratio that high, right? It might always be under 1. So it might be hard to tell, right? But assuming the best quote-unquote price, again, it's not a real price, but in the sacrifice phase was 0.0001, excluding volume bonuses, you know, that might be the baseline for which to judge whether or not you're getting a good deal swapping PLSX for PLS. But what you're going to want to do is, obviously, everybody got in on a different day, at a different price, and with a different volume bonus, too, and different size, you know, sacrifice. So you want to try to calculate your specific sacrifice price. If you didn't get in on day 1 through 10 in PLSX, then your price is obviously a little bit worse than 0.0001. It might be 0.00009. You know what I mean? So try to calculate your specific sacrifice price, quote unquote, and then do the math yourself based on this to see whether or not you're getting a good deal. You know, you can just plug in your theoretical price into the PLSX side of the equation and then see what the liquidity pairs are. And if there's enough liquidity, then you just multiply the ratios together, and then you could basically plug in your price for PLSX, and then you could theoretically plug in maybe 0.0001 on PLS, and you could just see, you know, that way whether or not you're getting a good deal. But this is all very proprietary. It's very up to you. And it's going to depend on liquidity conditions and what price you got in at individually. So all in all, that's why I'm leaning towards it might be a better idea to buy PLS with HEX, but you'll probably be able to have an opportunity to buy PLS with PLSX as well to secure your bag. So in the end, guys, if this is too confusing for you, just sit it out and chill, because really you might mess it up and you might lose a lot of money. If you're really technically minded and you're okay with taking this kind of a risk, and you did miss out on the PulseChain, then maybe consider some of this to be some helpful starting point for you to calculate whether or not you're getting a good deal. Alright guys, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, of course. Leave a comment and share the video to help pump your own bags, make HEX, PulseChain, and PulseX go viral, and I'll see you on the next video.